Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And you may not know this, but at any time in the modern world, there are somewhere between 65 and 70 million refugees in various camps around the world. So tonight, we're going to talk about a very interesting approach to the refugee crisis. Our guest tonight is Sebastian Agignoae, who is the co-founder of the International Orchestra of Refugees. It sounds like such an intriguing concept, so an orchestra of refugees. So normally we would think of refugees as being kind of the poor huddled masses. But refugee camps, as I've come to understand through an organization you volunteer with, the United Nations Association, that refugee camps are like little cities, and people may live there for 5, 10, 20 years. So talk a little bit about how this orchestra that you founded helps the refugee crisis around the world.
Well, I think it's funny that you refer to some of these camps as little cities. One of the camps that you would call a little city is in Jordan. The name is Zatari Refugee Camp, and this little city hosts 1 million refugees.
1 million.
1 million.
That's not a little city. That's
not
a full-blown city.
That's bigger than the hometown that I grew up in.
Wow.
So the International Orchestra of Refugees, just within the name itself, I hope it invokes hope. So the International Orchestra of Refugees, it was founded a year ago. It's
founded by you alone, or were you in partnership
It was
with other
founded.
people?
It was founded by me alone, and I'll talk about a little bit about the founding. But what it entails, we hope to design for the International Orchestra of Refugees. We hope to design residencies for musicians who have been forcibly displaced from their homes.
Residency, sort of like a doctor would do a residency, or you mean someplace to actually live and
someplace to actually live and practice music in community. So what we hope to do with the International Orchestra of Refugees is travel from refugee site to refugee site, recruiting these displaced musicians into a full-sized conventional orchestra. And it's when I found out a year ago at the point in time, I didn't know that the world was buckled under the worst refugee crisis since World War II, where less than 1% of refugees are resettled in a third country. And you're right when you say there are 65 to 70 million displaced persons, but those displaced persons, not all of them are refugees. About a good fraction of them are.
So what would be the difference between a refugee and a displaced person?
Well, I like to think of them as one and the same, but the United Nations 1951 Convention on Refugees labels that refugees are persons who flee from persecution, from violence. But nowadays, it's evolved in such a way where climate change is forcing people to migrate from one place to another.
Whether they have a place to go or not, they have to leave wherever they are.
Oh yeah. The International Organization for Migration says that by 2050, an estimated 200 million persons are looking to be displaced from their homes.
200 million?
Yeah, because of the trajectory as to where climate change is going today.
I mean, the population of the United States is only about 350 million, so that's more than half the size of the United States.
It's staggering, isn't it?
It is. Staggering is the right word.
It's a dismal number. For citizens of the United States to look at, refugees being within United States citizens being refugees, I looked at what was happening in California, in Malibu, just last month for the wildfires, and I would be reading these stories that have been published in the paper about how 7,000 people have been displaced and are now living in a tent camp outside of Walmart.
Yeah.
And it was so easy for me to make the distinction between a community like that and a community, say, in Zatari, Jordan, where persons are suddenly living in these tent camps.
So it's really, I mean, physically it's the same thing. You're living in a tent camp because you've been forced out of your house. You've
been forced out of your house. From the refugees that I've spoken with, some of them, there's a wide array of stories of why they're forced out of their homes, be it from violence, be it from persecution. from a governmental body, be it even a person's sexual orientation, climate change. There's a group of, I was at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. They have an East-West Center. I was there this summer. And I was introduced to a community of people from Micronesia. And they were being hosted in Hawaii. And I was stunned to learn that in Micronesia, their islands would just be swallowed by the sea. And so suddenly they have...
Their home is gone
their
forever.
home's gone.
Yeah.
So that's the problem that we're dealing with. We're dealing with one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world right now.
Now, interestingly, when you mentioned the people who have fled the wildfires, some years ago when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and so many people had to leave the city, the news media initially referred to those people as refugees, and the White House at the time forced them to stop using that term, said they are not refugees. They're people who have been displaced because of a storm. And I think that the idea was that the word refugee has such connotations, carries a lot of baggage, that the White House felt that, well, we don't have refugees in the United States, certainly not within the continental boundaries here. But in fact, as we've just mentioned with the people camping out in Walmart, there's very little physical distinction between someone who's been displaced because of a storm, which may or may not be related to climate change, but many global scientists seem to think that it is, and those displaced by violence. The only difference being in the storm case, where you take the people in Malibu, theoretically you can rebuild those homes and people can move back at some point, whereas with political violence, you don't know, you may never go back. But the problem of displaced people is so significant and growing that you wonder why it doesn't get more attention. And I think it may be, correct me if I'm wrong, you know more about this than I do, that it's sort of like homelessness. Everyone knows it exists, but they kind of don't want to deal with it. Well, that's those homeless people. Well, it's their fault that they're homeless, and so forget about them. And do you sense that there's something about the refugee crisis as well? It's like, well, you know, you shouldn't have been born in Syria. No, it was your fault.
Yeah, a lot of people associate refugees with people being from the Middle East, when really there's a refugee crisis happening all around the world. I went to Hong Kong to work with the Hong Kong Philharmonic, seeking guidance. I was with them in April, and I met with some political figures there after a concert at the Hong Kong Cultural Center, and I told them that we had a strong focus on the Middle East, and they were quick to say, "Oh, but are you not looking at what's happening in South America?" And humbly I said, "No, I wasn't, because I myself am not aware of all the crises happening around the world."
Well, speaking of South America, Venezuela has such an enormous economic crisis that people are fleeing the country in large numbers. And can you consider them refugees? Well, certainly you could look at it with that perspective, because they're fleeing because they don't feel that they can have a valid life in their home country. So it's the same kind of idea, right?
Oh yeah, same. Even in Central America, the migrant caravan too.
Right.
With the word refugee, hidden in that word is refuge, and that's what people are looking for. These people who are suddenly displaced, they're seeking refuge. They're seeking someplace safe because they don't feel safe in the place that they're in right now.
Well, so let's come back to the orchestra then.
Of course.
So the orchestra, the plan, as I understand it, is to find people who are seeking refuge, and those who already play music or are interested in becoming musical, and give them an outlet. How does this benefit the refugees? Even suppose they sign up, if I'm a refugee and I play and I sign up, how does that benefit me?
How does it benefit you?
Yes, as a refugee.
As a refugee. So it provides a multitude of things, one of which I hope will provide opportunity to provide for their families, to generate an income, to use their skill set, their masterful skill set. Some of these refugees I've met are such incredible musicians. There's one Syrian, and I won't disclose any names, but there's one Syrian violinist who, when the conflict really heightened in 2011, she came here to the United States in 2013. She is an incredibly talented violinist, and she said to me, oftentimes people, when they look at Syria, they think of conflict, when really, do you know that Syria, the oldest sheet music ever recorded was found in Syria. Syria's roots are so rich in such a prosperous culture, even musically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
but oftentimes it's completely hidden by war and conflict. So it would benefit the refugee by providing opportunity to connect themselves, reconnect themselves with their skill sets. It also provides them, brings them back to that sense of purpose.
So, would you? From what you say, there would be pay here. I mean, the orchestra would perform for a fee, right? So people obviously, like any orchestra, touring orchestra, get paid in order to go perform, right? So is that the kind of idea that you would assemble this orchestra of these people who can, really play, and then take it around and essentially be a booking agent and book this orchestra? Is that
Yeah,
the general concept?
that's what we hope. That's what we hope to do. We hope to provide them these opportunities
Mm-hmm.
and provide them the means to support themselves and to support their families as well.
So how would you deal with the visa and passport issue? Because I would think as a refugee, it's difficult if you're not living in your home country. It's hard to go to your own embassy or go.
We're figuring that out right now. So as a precursor to this physical orchestra, the IOR, our team is generating a strategic plan,
Mm-hmm.
and the physical orchestra will actually come later down the line. As a precursor to the
Mm-hmm.
physical orchestra, what we're going to implement is a virtual orchestra, almost as if it's a virtual database.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the virtual landscape, unlike the physical landscape, there aren't really borders that you have to be concerned about. That's right. You can connect persons, not physically, but virtually. A person in a refugee camp, you can connect them with persons all across the globe to the global community. And so this virtual orchestra will be hosted on our webpage, iorrefugees.org, and it's going to be a virtual database where we compile a group of musicians of displaced persons. By 2023, we hope to have a minimum of at least 500. Out of 70 million displaced persons.
It seems like a drop in the bucket, but on the
It
other
seems
hand,
like a drop in the bucket.
there's an old phrase from one of the nonprofits I'd worked with, a drop in the ocean. They say, well, maybe the ocean was thirsty for just that drop. And it's to say, look, don't stop doing it just because it may seem small. You don't know the ripple effects that this drop might have, and they might be significant, and they might be significantly good, is the hope. So this database that you had assembled, theoretically people could be anywhere in the world and be in this database.
Yeah, so one of the two primary purposes of this database is to connect these displaced musicians with prospective employers, with with the city that they're in, their respective symphony orchestra, with potential benefactors that would hire these persons out for house parties, soirees. But not only connect them with those opportunities, this database would connect these displaced musicians amongst each other. So say a displaced person living in Berlin can suddenly become aware of other displaced musicians within their own community. And that's how we're going to formulate and generate IOR satellite ensembles.
Satellite meaning they wouldn't communicate via satellite, just meaning like a satellite office kind of thing.
Kind of like a satellite office.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But they'd all be in cooperation with the International Orchestra of Refugees, and we would help mitigate and facilitate any arrangements.
Just as an aside, so
Sure.
a few years ago I went to a show here in Chicago, and there was a Polish jazz band, 4 guys who were really talented. They were great, but they didn't meet till they were here in the United States. They were all from Poland, but it was this same level of connection that you're talking about. They lived in Chicago. They didn't know each other, but somehow they got introduced. They realized they were all from Poland. They all shared a language and a culture and a kind of a musical culture as well.
It wasn't the Chopin Festival, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was, what was the name of it? I don't know, it'll come to me after the show. I'm sure I'll remember what the name of the festival was. But it's the same idea, that they were able to come together. Now that was just happenstance, but in the case of the IOR, the International Orchestra of Refugees, you're trying to set that up to make that more possible. So in a sense, it's a social networking attempt as well, right?
Yeah, and it's all in actually in thanks to a really dear good friend of mine in New York, Belen. She came up to me and she said, Sebastian, she's from Spain, so she said in her strong accent, she said to me, your orchestra, it's a great idea, but it limits your work to 100 like a conventional size orchestra to 100 persons, when it can be so much bigger than that. And so, so she introduced me. She was the one that proposed a virtual component, which opens it up from 100 to an endless number of persons that can participate. Yeah. And she's also a good friend. When I was in Hong Kong visiting the Hong Kong Philharmonic, that's when she first contacted me. She's with the Refugee Nation, and the Refugee Nation, they were a group that wanted, for the 2016 Olympics, that's when the refugee team was first debuted, the group of 10 persons in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Playing what sports, or all different?
All various kind of sports. Yeah. But there was a group of persons that noticed that these people didn't have a flag to represent them, nor did they have an anthem. So they commissioned a Syrian designer to come up with the flag, which is the flag that I wear in my lapel. And
your business card has that design on it.
And yeah, yes. That's right. It's very strikingly similar to the to a life jacket. Orange color life jacket, almost as a tribute to the persons that cross the Mediterranean Sea, many of which their lives are lost on that treacherous journey.
So is there also an online component? I mean, I think about friends of mine who actually participate musically with each other. There's some, I've never used it, but there's a software that they use called Kazam, and it allows someone in Los Angeles to actually play in real time with someone in Chicago. And it's, you know, it has its drawbacks. It's bandwidth constrained, but it works well enough that these people can actually do this and try to actually enjoy each other's musical company, even though they're half a continent apart. Is there some element of that you think about in terms of this international orchestra?
Oh, of course. While these persons are confined within their own refugee camps, being almost nearly impossible to get out of, that's something that we've considered. We have to further investigate that in terms of like how we're going to be able to logistically make that happen, connecting refugees with different refugees inside different camps, and connecting those refugees to, say, auditorium full of general citizens of the public.
Well, I think certainly you talk about within the same camp, the camp that you mentioned in, is it Syria, where there's 1 million strong?
Jordan. Zatari.
In any city of 1 million people, imagine how many musicians there would be who don't know each other. There would be lots, right? So your database, your online system, would be able theoretically to link those people so that they could at least find each other in the same camp, right?
Yeah. We say by 2023 we hope to have at least 500 musicians, but something's tapping me on my shoulder saying maybe it could be significantly much more than that.
Well, it's good to set goals, to have something to aim at, right? So tell me a little bit about your own musical background and why you saw music as the path here. In fact, I remember in a conversation you and I had some months ago at the United Nations Association, you mentioned that maybe music really can save the world. So tell me a little bit about your view of music and its place in the world and why you chose this as your way to try to reach out to refugees.
Sure. I started playing the piano in 1st grade. My mom forced me to, and I didn't like it. I really didn't, but then there was a teacher I came across who taught me how to, not how to technically, she taught me how to technically play, but she taught me how to love the instrument and how to appreciate it. And that had me see the value in the instrument, how it's been really strong in my life in terms of, it allows me to focus, and it provides me with a sense of purpose in a lot of the work I do. And
you're not a professional performing musician, though. I mean, you don't make your living, or do you make your living?
Well, I paid a lot of college off playing piano in the city.
Yeah. So do you have?
So thanks, Mom.
Yeah. She introduced you to a way to have fun and make some money at it.
Yeah.
Right?
No. Yeah. Yeah. As a college student, it was really beneficial.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And for me, English wasn't my first language. Polish was my first language. So I've also, run into languages within my lifetime too, having to go to ESL classes, English second language. So the notion of language has always been prominent within my life, and that's how I looked at music. And when I learned more about the refugee crisis, which I'll tell you more of the
Mhm.
inception story, how this all happened. When I learned of the refugee crisis, I immediately was convicted to say we have something must be done.
Mhm.
How can we make this more relatable? How can we almost humanize refugees for the general public? How can we invoke this paradigm shift?
And make them less abstract. It's
Yeah.
not an abstract problem. These are real people we're talking about.
Yeah, these are real people.
Yeah.
They haven't been within my field of vision, or so I thought. Last year, I was looking through my family's security box, and inside that security box, I found a document from 1988 signed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and it had my family's last name on it. Granted, at this point in time, the notion of refugees wasn't anywhere in my life. But I went to my parents and I said, what is this? Like, whose first name is this? And I saw it had my dad's birthday, and that's when I kind of said, you guys want to tell me what's going on? And my dad, that's when he
Yeah.
says, yeah, I was a refugee, which is something that I didn't know.
Really?
And instantly I felt such a stronger connection to my dad.
And it brought home the reality, the personal reality of what it might mean to be a refugee, right?
Oh, yeah, but even so, at that point in time, I didn't even know many of the statistics of the refugee crisis.
Yeah.
So I started looking more into it. And when I saw that this is the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II, when I saw that less than 1% of refugees are resettled, when I saw that year by year the numbers are growing more and more, I said, oh my goodness. I was convicted. I told myself, I'm the son of a refugee. I'm the son of a refugee, and it's the refugee people I will serve. But how? Because it's hard to connect with refugees coming from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, different faith backgrounds. It's hard to connect. Even language, there's such strong language barriers. But something that to that point in time, even today, I was very confident on was that music is a universal language. And so we all have a heartbeat. We all have a sense of rhythm. We all have that beating heart. Music is something that almost anyone can connect to.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. You know, as you know, I'm also a musician, and so I feel the very same way that you know, my band has performed, and people have just shown up on occasion. People we don't know. I mean, they will know somebody who sent them over, but we played a show about a year and a half ago, and a young kid who lived in the neighborhood, 15-year-old, came by, and he'd heard us once before, the previous year, and he came by and said, can I sit in with you guys? Well, he had been playing since he was 2, and he had graduated from the School of Rock in Park, and he stepped up, and he was fabulous, and he's 15, and we thought the same thing. We didn't know him at all, but we all spoke this common language of music. We all understood it, we all felt it, and it was a way for people who don't know each other at all to come together and connect. And I would think, in particularly the case of refugees, where severing of a connection is a big part of a refugee life, this is a way to reestablish a new connection, right?
Yes, and one through music. Again, music being this universal language. Even should you not speak the same language,
right?
You have music in common, and I really am confident that that's how we can connect more of the general public with refugees. And with the refugee crisis today, it really can be so disheartening. I was at the United Nations headquarters in New York City for the second and the fifth negotiation of something called the Global Compact on Migration, which was ratified just this week in Marrakesh, Morocco, with 164 countries signing on. And granted, this is a global compact. It's not legally binding like a treaty would be.
Right.
But I remember being present for the second and fifth negotiations, and after those meetings, some persons would come back out and kind of relay to me everything that transpired in those meetings and those negotiations, and oftentimes it'd be disheartening conversations. Governments are overwhelmed by what's going on, and as I'm not surprised. because they themselves cannot approach the refugee crisis by themselves.
Well, and as you've seen, it's caused tremendous backlash, especially in Western Europe. You know, German Chancellor Merkel is essentially stepping down because she allowed so many refugees in, and it enraged so many on the right wing in her country that she's been essentially not forced to resign, but she kind of realized the writing was on the wall, so she's stepping down. Much of the rise of the nationalism in Western Europe, even in this country, I think is due to the idea that well, all these foreigners, these people who aren't like us, are suddenly overwhelming us and they're coming in. And so you're right, the governments don't quite know how to deal with this. You can't just open borders and allow millions of people in, because that creates its own set of crises.
Yeah.
But you also can't just ignore it. Something has to happen.
You're right. And the polarization of this overall crisis is immense.
Mm-hmm.
And leaving it just to the governments, I don't think it's going to work. Which is why I really firmly believe they need some assistance from the public and the private sectors as well.
Mm-hmm.
Organizations like the International Orchestra of Refugees, and hopefully our organization will be able to better highlight, better put light on this crisis.
And as we mentioned earlier, to humanize it. As you say, the music is really an international language. And so I would think that people who aren't tuned in or attuned to the refugee crisis could still hear this music and think, oh, those are people just like me, or wow, those are really talented people. They're not those others, or terrorists, or drug dealers, or rapists, or whatever it is that, you know, all the reactionaries would like, the labels they would like to apply.
It's very easy for us to vilify this community, but as soon as we start vilifying this community, that's when it leads to dehumanization. That's when it leads to destruction, to horror. It's
a bad path.
It's a bad path to go on.
Yeah.
We need a stronger path, one built on the foundation of hope, one built on something that we can all connect with. And music, you know, there are other varieties that we can pursue too. Sports are a lot of people, where a lot of people connect with too. And I know that the Olympic Refuge Foundation was just launched. Their board of directors was put together under the Olympic Committee, the IOC. It was put together just a year ago, and that's something that they're going to be focusing on too. So using something as a common ground to bring all of us together, because we need a common plan for our common home.
Because we all do live here, and we all share this common home, right? So we've only got about a minute left, but what steps do you want to see taken next, and how can people help you with this organization?
Sure. If there are any refugees within your local communities that play instruments, we'd really like to connect with them. We want to use this initiative as a means for refugees to prosper, to not just survive. So we'll be formulating generating satellite ensembles, and we hope to establish better partnerships with symphony orchestras across the globe. And we really are going to rely on support from public. Just to encourage us on.
Well, I hope the millions of people who watch this show, not quite, will take that message to heart and help out. So Sebastian, I want to thank you so much for being here. It's been great having you as a guest.
Thanks for having me here.
And thank you for joining us again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.